So I think I might have lied when I said I was going to split this video into two, because it looks like we're going to have not two, not three, but 4 parts. Maybe 5. A lot happened in Vietnam. Today we're back on topic with the F-4 Phantom, aka Double Ugly, aka the Smokestack, aka the Lead Sled. And this time we're going to talk about its service history and development in the first half of Vietnam. And the short version is that when the Phantom got dropped into the war, it kind of looks something like this.
Pull the lever, Crunk.
Since the story of the Phantom's use in the air war in Vietnam is effectively just the story of the air war in Vietnam, I'm just going to start from the beginning. So, back when the Cold War started, the US opened up the theory of containment to stop the spread of communist influence, and they knew that if they had to fight the Soviet Union on the European continent, the other territories in the region would have to be defended. And I say territories, not countries, because after World War II, most of Europe's economic charts were flatter than cutting boards. There was so little left in them that America could have just conquered the entire place if they really wanted to. But they didn't. While the US could have gone full "this is Sparta" on the remaining governments fairly easily, defending that entire region against a peer threat like the Soviet Union would be way too expensive. Call it a little trick we learned from the Greeks, the Romans, the Persians, and like every major empire before us.
Gonna show them a little trick I learned!
The more stuff you have, the more stuff you gotta protect, which means more stuff you need to protect that other stuff and more money you have to spend on the protecting stuff. Oh, and if the protecting stuff got attacked, it would take a lot of time to reinforce it with even more protecting stuff. Are you confused yet? Good. Now you know how America felt looking at that. They realized it would be much more cost-effective to broker agreements with the other countries and build them up so they could stave off the Soviets long enough for the US to show up and turn the invading forces into the world's biggest war museum. Yeah, the best strategy we could come up with was to create a multi-country-sized buffer zone. Granted, the Soviets did that too, but they didn't offer buffer zones nice things like trade and military aid. They just offered them servitude or death. Sharing is caring. But America chooses capitalism, and capitalism means making deals, and deals have prices, and for France, that meant the US had to help them out in the Indochina War against their rebelling colonies. So the US set up a base of operations for military advisors in Saigon in September of 1950, but after the French lost that war, they passed the baton to the USA fully in 1955. Which is great for America, right? War's over, we don't need to support them anymore, we can just move on with our lives and find something else to worry about. Science. At least until it wasn't.
Oh joy.
Because in 1960, Vietnamese rebels that had been gathering over the last few years solidified into a genuine rebel force for the National Liberation Front, which wanted to overthrow the South Vietnamese government and reunify the country. And you would think that would make them none of America's business, with the exception of one fact. They were communists. When the Vietnamese Communists, also known as the Viet Cong or VC, began the rebellion in the South, America would bring in more and more military power starting in December of 1961. And this would come to a head in May of 1964 when the VC mined a World War II escort carrier called the USS Card while it was docked, bringing in fighter bombers and helicopters. I'm going to say that again, but slower. Not only did the North Vietnamese just touch America's boats, they touched America's carriers. And for some reason, we waited until they did it again. On August 2nd, 1964, North Vietnamese torpedo boats dropped torps at one of the US destroyers running signals intelligence in the Gulf of Tonkin, the USS Maddox. Somebody has now committed the cardinal sin of touching America's boats twice, and 3 days later, F-4B Phantoms arrived in theater to run bomber escort for the first combat mission of the war, Operation Pierce Arrow, where US Navy aircraft bombed a petroleum reserve near Vinh and several naval vessels. And within 2 days of that, Congress would approve President Lyndon B. Johnson's Tonkin Gulf Resolution. This resolution said, and I quote, "Congress approves and supports the determination of the President as Commander-in-Chief to take all necessary measures to repel any armed attack against the forces of the United States and to prevent further aggression." Not stop, not counter, prevent. I'm trying to tell you that Congress just gave the president, known for having conversations with officials while naked in the bathtub, a blank check to use the freedom condom. Dominance is about to be inserted.
Isom.
And when the National Liberation Front rebels swung at Camp Holloway near Pleiku on February 7th, 1965, those F-4B Phantoms would go back into combat by way of Operation Flaming Dart. It wasn't a whole lot, they just sprinkled some freedom flowers over military targets across the DMZ, that being Demilitarized Zone, but it sent a message, and that message was fuck around and find out. The North Vietnamese, did not care.
We do not care.
In fact, they actually decided to poke back by blowing up a US Army barracks in South Vietnam. So the US came back with Operation Flaming Dart 2 on February 10th and 11th, because, you know, always double tap. That didn't work. So you know what you do if hitting them really hard doesn't work?
Have you tried hitting them harder?
March 2nd, 1965, the US would kick off Operation Rolling Thunder. This was a gradually increasing bombing campaign meant to slowly throttle the North Vietnamese support for the VC into submission, effectively powering up like Goku in a boss fight. However, just as the bombing campaign would power up, so would the threats the US air crews came to face. On June 17th, Navy Phantoms from the Midway scored the first confirmed MiG kill of the war, but that hype would go out the window 1 week later on the 24th when an SA-2 Guideline surface-to-air missile scored its first kill on American forces by downing an F-4C. This event slapped the US back to reality and started the chain reaction that created Project Weasel in October. And before you ask, yes, this is where the Wild Weasel mission set and the Suppression of Enemy Air Defenses, or SEAD mission, came from. The North Vietnamese shot down one plane and the US Air Force went from 0 to in about 4 months. However, because of politicians acting like they know how to fight a war and not wanting to fight China, even though they were kind of already there, they put down a rule of engagement that US forces couldn't bomb the surface-to-air missile, or SAM, sites or the anti-aircraft emplacements. Those rules also require that the military fly all of its bombers and strike aircraft down the same attack corridors, so those same emplacements that couldn't be bombed were all clustered around that area. In fact, a famous officer that we'll get to in a bit once said that there were more anti-aircraft guns within a 50-mile radius of Hanoi than Germany had in all of World War II. Additionally, while the US forces started kicking in the MiG-17s that were available at the start of the war in a 4-to-1 ratio, the Vietnamese got their tactics sorted out in a hurry, as one generally does when they're on the receiving end of getting boot put to ass. The most prominent of these were hit-and-run tactics used to scare American strikers into ditching their bomb loads and bugging out, and get a few kills if they were lucky. By the end of June, US Armed Forces had lost 55 planes to dogfights and ground fire, and by the end of 1965, the experienced pilots who had started the conflict were being rotated out for the new guys. There were a few problems with this. Those new guys weren't being introduced via combat against the MiGs, but on the more common Troops in Contact, or TIC missions. These were close air support missions where they would rewrite a little topography to tell some of the VC to get lost. But for the first few of those, they would run missions called Trees in Contact, where they would practice by just bombing trees. I guess they heard the Lorax talking smack.
And they took exception to that.
Frankly, they didn't have a lot of combat experience or even practice, period, and it wouldn't take long for this to come back and hit them like a sledgehammer. As it turns out, when you don't straight up obliterate everything quickly, you give the enemy time to build up defenses. And all the gradual bombing of Rolling Thunder had done up to this point was give the North Vietnamese that time. For example, on the 6th of February in 1966, US forces got their first visual on a MiG-21, and they began encountering them in combat that April. The North Vietnamese had been picking up more MiG-17 fighters and adding more technologically advanced ones like the MiGs 19 and 21 starting the year before. Not to mention they buffed out their ground defenses with more SA-2s and more 23, 37, 57, 85, and even 100mm anti-aircraft guns, which the NVA would aim using balloons at different altitudes as an aiming reference. North Vietnamese pilots also quickly figured out that forcing the Phantoms to maneuver would make them bleed a metric ton of airspeed. The sky's been blue for too long and it's time to paint it red. So whenever ground control vectored the MiGs in on the Phantoms, the NVA would use pincer tactics and ambushes to force them to turn, compounding on their awareness of ground fire to bracket them into a fight. And given the fact that ground fire was taking them out like goldfish in a barrel, it should come as absolutely no surprise that some of those Phantom pilots would rather be the snack that fires back. By July of 1966, the US Air Force had transferred the Wild Weasel mission set from the F-100Fs and F-105Fs to the Wild Weasel 4 F-4Cs, aka the EF-4Cs. But as you can imagine, it's pretty difficult to dodge a telephone pole coming at you at the speed of Mach Jesus and a literal flying brick. And EF-4C pilots would quickly come to refer to their excursions as dancing with death.
Fear me if you dare. This is gonna be fun.
And the MiG antics were getting in close and fouling the American All-Stars team on top of it because the Phantoms couldn't engage from a beyond visual range or BVR position thanks yet again to the many rules of engagement, aka politicians thinking they know how a war works. These rules stopped US forces from attacking airfields for the same reasons as the SAM sites, but it also prevented them from engaging enemy targets without visual confirmation. Now, the whole confirm the enemy is hostile before you engage them part was intended to prevent friendly fire, so the politicians politicians wouldn't have to explain a friendly fire incident to the already pissed off US public. On top of that, identification friend or foe, or IFF technology, wasn't available in the US forces yet, and without it, there was no consistent way to identify who was gonna shoot you and who wasn't. For reference, an IFF system has two parts, a transponder and a receiver. The transponder puts out a certain frequency, and the receiver checks to see if an incoming frequency is a friendly one. If you're seeing a friendly frequency, it's a friend. If you're not, it's not. And then you can schedule that not friendly an appointment with its deity of choice from a distance. But IFF didn't exist yet in any usable quantity, so visual only it was. Murphy's laws of combat, anything meant to be used together is always going to be delivered separately. There were a few cases where the visual confirmation rule actually prevented friendly fire, but in most cases, BVR without IFF was the military incarnation of putting the cart before the horse. As a result, Phantoms always had to engage in dogfights with the much more agile MiGs without reliable close-in weapons or enough training to know that you shouldn't turn with something smaller than you. Unless you're that one American Airlines Huey that shot down a biplane with an AK-47. What? So the US is fighting with two wings folded up over their heads, and it gets worse. North Vietnamese pilots would prioritize strike aircraft and bomb-laden fighters like the F-105 Thunder Chiefs, and the way they would do this in the air is they would identify their targets visually from below by looking at their formations. Navy and Air Force formations differed during the war, with the Air Force sticking to the World War II-era Fluid 4 formations, also sometimes called the Finger 4. The Fluid 4 stuck the number 1 plane furthest forward with numbers 2 and 3 off of their wings, and number 4 off of number 3's wing. Thuds would be packed into these formations like a can of sardines, while Air Force fighters would be more spread out. Navy fighters, however, would operate on the loose deuce formation instead, sticking to more spread out pairs of aircraft. The Navy formation ended up being better because both aircraft were able to flex between engaging and defending. But for the Air Force, due to both policy and what appears to be a fairly consistent characteristic of having a stick up their ass, only the lead F-4 Phantom was allowed to fire on a target. The other three were stuck with being glorified bodyguards unless the flight got split up, and even then, the wingmen were still being blue-balled out of first-shot chances. So whenever Phantoms got engaged by the MiGs would already know who they were fighting, how they would fight, and what tactics they should use to win. When the MiGs actually went for the Phantoms, they knew what they were doing and they had a plan. Know your enemy, know yourself, real Sun Tzu 101 type of stuff going on here, except America's not the one using it. Something was going to have to change if the war was going to go anywhere fast. Enter Colonel Robin Olds, and later, Colonel Daniel Chappie James Jr., taking command of the 8th Tactical Fighter Wing in September of 1966. If I could go back in time and talk to anyone, it would be this man right here. The Fat Electrician gave a pretty sound overview of this man in his video, so I'll keep the introduction here quick. After earning the respect of his pilots and training them in dogfighting with his World War II experience, he would pull together a mission that I have called the foundation of aerial electronic deception warfare. Colonel Olds is gonna lie to the North Vietnamese using things they can't even see and come up with tricks they're not gonna live to talk about, and he's gonna look and sound like the most gangster man on the planet the entire time. January 2nd, 1967, Colonel Olds, Colonel James, and the 8th Tactical Fighter Wing decide to use similar call signs, flight patterns, and an elaborate plan to bypass the BS rules of engagement and trick North Vietnamese MiG-21s to come up and fight them. And one of the cornerstone technologies was the use of the QRC-170 jamming pod. That, up to this point, had only been carried by F-105 Thunder Chief fighter bombers. This was used as a somewhat passive defense against surface-to-air missiles that would jam the radar seekers as they homed in on the thuds, and by mounting it to the F-4s, the North Vietnamese would be that much more deceived into thinking they weren't charging into a deathmatch. Olds was originally going to launch the attack on New Year's Day, but the weather wasn't ideal, so he pushed it back. He knew that the MiGs would visually confirm their targets through observation of formation, so he needed to rule out line-of-sight contact to get the MiGs in close, thus needing overcast weather. But he knew he couldn't launch the attack too much later because he had to get the Navy, Air Force, and Marine Corps to ground all aircraft for the day, and get a pair of C-130B-2 Silver Dawn communications surveillance planes in the air to listen in on ground control without getting approval from the commanding officers at the NSA.
Then how did he get there?
On the Blackbird we appropriated.
You stole the Blackbird?
The 28 Phantoms used on this mission would go out and force the North Vietnamese into 13 minutes of combat, and after an F-104 starfighter group escorted the Phantoms back to Udon, Thailand, they tallied up the results. 7 MiG-21 kills, no American losses. And while 7 might not sound like a lot compared to the 28 fighters they went out with, this was estimated to be about half the MiG-21s they had in service at the time. Truth be told, the North Vietnamese only had about 45 to 60 MiGs of all kinds in service at any given time, but they would keep replenishing the ones that got shot down. But despite getting hit for half their Air Force, I guess the North Vietnamese thought this was a fluke. And I say this because the Air Force had to double tap the feat a few days later when another Phantom pretended to be on a recon mission. Fool me once, shame on you. Fool me twice, shame on me. And after this, the North Vietnamese were like, nope, I'm out, we're not doing this, and called off all MiG activity for the next 4 months.
Sure is quiet out there.
However, even without the MiGs, there were plenty enough threats from ground fire, and the smokestack had more than enough fun with that. Just ask Captain John Pardo. On March 10th, 1967, Pardo, his backseater Lieutenant Steve Wayne, and their flight of F-4 Phantoms went out to attack a steel mill near Hanoi. But during the run-in, Captain Earl Amon and Lieutenant Robert Houghton in the number 4 plane got hit with AAA. He survives the hit, finishes the attack run, and then on the way out, he gets hit a second time, and Pardo gets hit too. The Rhinos shrug all of that off, and their planes turn for home. Or so it seems. Turns out those hits caused giant fuel leaks, and it didn't take long for Amon to radio Pardo like, hey, I'm leaking gas, I don't think I'm gonna make it back home. To which Pardo basically responds, cool, I'll walk you back. Obviously this was a gross oversimplification because Pardo was also leaking fuel. Unlike Amon, however, he had enough fuel left to make it to a tanker where he could refill and go home, and given that his engines were stuttering from the flak burst, he probably should, but he doesn't. Pardo decides he is going to stay with Amon and make sure he gets home, thinking he can use the time to come up with a strategy that could better their chances. And guess what? Come up with something he does, and as Pardo slides in behind his wingman, it is at this point that he dons his plot armor and says, hold my beer, we're gonna push you home.
You're gonna do what?
Pardo had Amon ditch the braking parachute behind the smiley face hatch under the tail. The idea being that he would dock the nose of his airplane into that compartment to push him back. Pardo also gave the order to shut off their engines to save what little fuel Amon might be able to. This also prevented the jet wash from blasting him every which way across the sky and let him push in and dock his aircraft at the back door. Problem was, that nose was built for ramming the air into submission, not the ass into submission, and he was having too much trouble keeping the sniffer in the hole for that to work. So he backed off and racked his brains a little harder for a different idea and then remembered something. The F-4Cs kept their tail hooks from the original Navy models because they might be helpful in case of an emergency. And I don't know about you, but I think this counts because I feel like most people in this situation would be like, so he radios up to Amon and tells him to drop his tailhook, and when he does, he gently flies up and rests it against the forward glass of his canopy. Pause. I understand this is like ballistic glass up front, but it's still freaking glass. He is using a several-inch thick plate of glass to push a 30,000-pound fighter jet. This is like using your hand to push a stove by grabbing the burner while it's still hot and just tanking it. You thought I was kidding when I said he donned his plot armor, huh? And if that wasn't proof enough, when Pardo got separated from Amon because of turbulence and nose back up, when the tailhook landed on the canopy again, it cracked. But it held. He would keep giving Amon a nudge every 15 seconds, which would keep cracking the glass, but also slow the descent to about 1,500 feet per minute and get them a distance of 88 miles. But that was as far as they got, because just then, Pardo got an alert that his left engine was on fire. He needed both engines to keep up the push, so he gave it the old tech support try and turned it off and on again, only for the fire to also turn back on again. He shut it off again, looked down at his gas tank, and realized that he was out of gas. The gig is up. But by this point, they were just over the border to Laos, which was as close to home as they were gonna get, so Pardo ordered Amon and Lieutenant Houghton to eject, before doing the same with himself and Lieutenant Wayne. After 45 minutes of dodging the natives allied with the North Vietnamese in the area, a rescue helicopter arrived and got them both out. Pardo and Wayne would receive the Silver Star for their actions, but originally some genius top brass wanted to press charges against Pardo for not bringing back his multi-million-dollar fighter jet. Because every once in a while, some officer starts to think like a politician and needs to be overruled by the people who can actually think. But But while Pardo was pushing it real good, the North Vietnamese were reorganizing their tactics and their fighting forces to come back at the Americans in more force-on-force style engagements. However, Operation Bolo had also given the Air Force something to think about, and probably a bit of a slap upside the head that dogfighting wasn't quite out of the picture yet. So when the MiGs returned in May of 1967, the Air Force pilots had a new surprise for them, the Su-16 gun pod. This was an M61A1 Vulcan 6-barrel rotary cannon stuffed into a pod, giving any equipped aircraft 1,200 rounds of 20mm ammunition and the ability to type up your obituary at 6,000 words per minute. The first kill with this new gun pod occurred on May the 14th, and the only case of the war where 2 gun kills were scored in a single flight was on the 6th of November that year, both achievements with Phantoms. However, Phantom pilots would still default to using missiles, and when they failed, the Su-16 came with its own drawbacks. For one thing, it didn't have a lead computing gun sight. Thank God the engineers gave the pilots such a high fire rate and large ammunition pool, because the aiming philosophy with this thing was less of an I'm gonna get ya and more of an I'm going to attack your general atmosphere approach. Accuracy by volume. I have a bullet with your name on it, but you'll have to give me a minute because I have to figure out which one. And for high deflection shots, a pilot would have a hell of a time eyeballing that lead because a Su-16 pod used a pop-out ram air turbine for power that looks more like those mist sprayers you grab at the amusement park because the sun's cooking you like a vampire who woke up on the wrong side of the clock. The gun was turbine-driven, and that means it's airflow-driven, which means if you're not moving fast enough, you're not firing fast enough. And once you got below 400 miles an hour, the gun pod would start losing fire rate. On an airplane, known for shedding airspeed like a dog in season every time you tried to crank the nose around. I'm trying to tell you that half the time you wanted to use the large underslung shaft to blow out somebody's back end, there was a 50-50 chance you were going to have performance issues. Which is why they gave it Viagra, an internal power system, when they later upgraded to the Su-23. This meant a pilot didn't have to worry about keeping it up, and it also came with the option of being linked to a lead computing gun sight so you could actually tell where you were putting your load.
Yeah, boy.
But probably the biggest downside of the gun pod was that it replaced one of the drop tanks, or all 3 if the pilot was crazy enough to bring 3 gun pods. No, it's not just War Thunder, this actually happened. And since the Flying Brick carried a 600-gallon tank on the center pylon and only 370-gallon tanks on the wings, picking up just the 1 gun pod would cut a Phantom's extra range just about in half. Because the J-79 engines would eat through gas like it's a hot dog eating contest. Seriously, internal fuel stores alone on the C model would give Double Ugly here about 36 minutes of fuel time, at most, at full throttle without the afterburners. And the drop tanks would add maybe another 12 minutes tops. And you know what? While we're on the subject of fuel range, there's something that was bugging me a lot when I started making this video, and it's the number of reports of the F-4 Phantom actually being good at close air support. See, during and after the Vietnam War, we got success stories like the A-1 Sky Raider, the A-37 Dragonfly, and the A-10 Warthog that specialized in close air support, and one of the primary arguments for these planes being really good at it is because they have better fuel range. So if the prevailing theory is that better fuel range and also slow speed equals better close air support, then why was something as fast and fuel-consuming as the Phantom so good at it? And why did we actually need the dedicated ground pounders?
Let him cook.
As you might expect, the devil is in the details. See, due to the F-4's high speed and low fuel range, it was only effective in practice against massed enemy forces, like what you would find in a force-on-force engagement. However, when ground troops came under fire from dispersed insurgent units taking up multiple positions for guerrilla warfare tactics, its high speed and low fuel economy prevented it from being able to make the multiple passes needed to locate and clear out every hostile position. To specifically handle counterinsurgency close air support, or COIN-CAS, low and slow aircraft dedicated to just that mission were required. And for normal CAS, the C-model Phantoms also had to get really, really low to effectively hit those targets because they'd have to dive bomb the enemy like it's World War II all over again. Though this would finally change in July of '67 when the Air Force introduced the AN/ASQ-91 weapons release computer on the brand new F-4Ds.
These nuts.
The F-4D also brought a general improvement to the radar of the F-4C, changing from the AN/APQ-109A to the 109V. The D model would become the second most produced version of the Phantom at 825 units built, which is understandable considering that later variants, nicknamed the Smart Ds, would also get avionics and pods for some of the US's first operational TV and laser-guided munitions, the AGM-62A Walleyes and the GBU-10B Paveways. And with their better avionics, F-4Ds were also well well suited to take over the Wild Weasel missions from the EF-4Cs as the war progressed, especially as they lost models during missions. And that pretty much covers all the Phantom's achievements from the start of the war to the end of 1967, so we'll leave off here for part 3 out of 4? 5? I'm not really sure at this point. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed what you saw, please consider checking out some of my other videos. You might like what you find. Until next time, dismissed.